Hello everyone, this is Jim Bergman with IACCM. Thank you for joining us today. It's my pleasure to introduce to you today Keld, who is a long-term friend. But before I do, I want to emphasize to those on the call to ask questions as we go through this. Obviously, if you're listening on a recorded basis, you won't be able to ask those questions, but by all means, you can always reach out to us at IACCM, and we can pass any questions along to Keld Jensen at some point in time. As I mentioned, Keld has been a long-time friend of IACCM's. He's been at a number of our physical events in Singapore and Europe and elsewhere, so we are very much looking forward to hearing what he has to share with us. Keld, I think it's probably best to allow me to let you make somewhat of a self-introduction so people get a little sense of your background, and then I'll let you get right into the material. And I'll probably interrupt you in a few minutes with questions as they come in. So Keld, off to you.
Thank you so much, Jim, and thank you for inviting me. Well, hello, everybody. My name obviously is Keld, and I am the chairman of an organization called Center for Negotiation that is primarily focused on assisting our clients in conducting negotiations. So we assist them prior to negotiation, during, and after. I'm associate professor at 3 different universities, 2 in Europe and 1 in the US, where I lecture when time allows on the executive MBA programs on behavioral economics, negotiation, and one thing that is very close to my heart is trust and the outcome of trust, which is very often success. Then I write frequently for Forbes magazine, both the printed version and online. And that is very relevant for our talks today because my brand new book that was just released 4 weeks ago is actually some of the most read articles from Forbes magazine I wrote that has been collected and put into to this book. Last but not least, I do a lot of presentation globally. I have some 50+ keynote speaking engagement from South America to Asia. And my main topic is behavioral economics. And just very briefly, if anybody's confused about the concept of behavioral economics, I usually use the term that behavioral economics is the marriage between traditional orthodox economics and psychology. So it's a reasonably new, 10, 15 years, new research area where people and researchers are studying the complexity between the financial side of the world combined with psychology. So it's all behavioral economics, trust, and negotiation. That is the combination and the content of my new book, Intelligent is Overrated, What You Really Need to Succeed. I'm very honored and happy to be able to give an intro to the book and the content and what it's all about. And basically, as the title indicates, intelligence is overrated. That's something I can talk about myself, and it's always nice having a personal introduction to something. And since my intelligence might not be the greatest, I thought, hey, I still made it somehow. So obviously, intelligence is not the most important thing. And I've been spending some 20, 25 years on looking into success, starting off specifically looking into success in negotiation. And that moved on into looking at how come some companies and individuals just seem to be more successful than others. And what made me very curious is that you could have 2 people that actually graduated from the same university and had the same faculty and the same topics, and they did everything was the same. They might even get the same grades. And then if you look at them 10 years later, one of them just took off and was way more successful in their ambitions and in their business life than the other one. And it was always very interesting to me to look into why is it that some people seem to be more successful than others. So that raised another topic, and that is, what is success really? And I've been asking thousands of people that, what is success? And if you look into it and look at a very formal introduction into success, and then first and foremost, the word success obviously comes from Latin, successes, which means success. And if you look into a dictionary, success is described very often as either the accomplishment of one goal, the attainment of wealth, position, honors, or the like, a performance or achievement that is marked by success as by the attainment of honors, or the last one, a personal thing that has success as measured by attainment of goals, wealth, etc. Now this sounds all very boring and theoretical. I like one of them, and that is success is the accomplishment of one's goals. And one's goals obviously is very different from one person to another. Now, if you just look at my PowerPoint slide for a second, we have Mr. Einstein up here, and he obviously had a lot of great comments. One of them is that everybody's a genius, but if you just judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, you will live a whole life believing that it's stupid. And I'm using that quote from Einstein simply because I do believe everybody is a genius, but they have to figure out where their brilliancy might be. So success for me is getting what you want, and happiness is wanting what you get. That's a famous quote from Dale Carnegie. So basically my new book is all about how intelligence is overrated. Intelligence is not that important in order to become successful in life. And I try to nail down what it really is required to be successful. And just repeating again what success is in my life is success is getting what you want. Now we just move on a little bit. Here you can see a copy, a photo of my new book. Obviously this is this commercial part where I do a bit of advertising saying, hey, if anybody is interested in that book, it's available. And as I said, we have nailed it down into some key topics in this book. And one of the key topics here obviously is, as I just said, what is it that creates success? What is it that really makes and assisting and help to create success in whatever that might be. And that is basically divided into the three areas I mentioned earlier. It is trust, behavioral economics, and negotiation. Now, what we have been doing in the last 6 years is studying 5,400 companies globally. And we have been looking into the 4 things that clearly identify those corporations, whether they're private or governmental or whatever, clearly that identify them more successful than others. And we came up with 4 things, as I mentioned, that clearly identify those that have more success than others. And those companies who have more success than others have a very clear identified strategy in their focus on negotiation. And to me, negotiation is way more than just sitting, selling something and negotiating a contract, or sitting in procurement department and negotiating a purchase. To me, it's really a question about defining a negotiation strategy both for an internal negotiation and an external negotiation. So those companies that are more successful than others has very clearly defined a negotiation strategy. And I could just ask all the listeners right now if anyone obviously could quote their corporation's official negotiation strategy. Very often when I ask that question out in real life, there's absolutely silence, because a lot of corporations and the employees haven't got a fixed negotiation strategy. And in my world, not having a settled fixed negotiation strategy would be the same as not having a corporate strategy, and not having a communication strategy, not having a human resource strategy, not having a go-to-market strategy, and not having all the fundamental strategies that most professional organization obviously has today. So having a clear negotiation strategy is one of the 4 findings that we have clearly identified is required in order to be successful.
Say, Keld, I got a question for you.
Sure.
How often have you seen in organizations somewhat of a chief negotiation officer? I mean, we certainly have, chief financial officers and, general counsels and chief procurement officers, vice presidents of sales. But how often do you actually spot a chief negotiation officer positioned within any organization?
I would answer that by saying that it's a little bit about what religion you believe in, because some organizations I meet believe in having a unique department that is an elite negotiation department. That means that it's a department that is focused on negotiation and nothing but negotiation. So that department would be used regardless whether it's procurement or it's project or it's sales or whatever. They would be called in and negotiate the actually hardcore deal. Those organizations that believe in that obviously have named a chief negotiation officer. Then you have other organizations that don't believe that's the right way forward, and they believe that the competence into negotiation should be distributed throughout the organization. Now, some of them still have appointed one today, but the majority of those organizations don't have one. My recommendation in general, whether you believe in one religion or the other religion, is basically to have a group of people, whether that might be 5, 10, 20, or 50, that is the backbone, that is the one that has the interest, the knowledge, and the understanding of the importance of negotiation throughout the organization. So, but just back to answer your questions very briefly, Jim, I would say less than 10% of organizations globally, if you look at the Fortune 500 today, has appointed a specific negotiation head. So it's absolutely the minority today.
And in those instances where they have done that, would they then be the organizations that do traditionally have corporate negotiation strategies? As you mentioned it, is that something that would fall into that organization and that
Yes.
chief
Yeah.
leader?
It is very often the case, the organizations that do have a head of negotiation and a negotiation officer is very often are the one that has more clearly defined a very clear negotiation strategy. Absolutely.
Okay, great, thanks.
The other items we have found that clearly describes those that are more successful than others is an item that some of you that have met me before have heard me talk about, and that's the concept of trust currency. As I mentioned, about 7 years ago, I woke up one day and had a general feeling that I felt that trust was at a lower level than it was ever before. I felt that you and I trusted each other less than we ever did before. I felt that organizations between each other trusted each other less than ever before. I felt that organizations and consumers and individuals trusted each other less than ever before. And I felt that strongly, so I wanted to write a book on that topic. And obviously, you just can't do a book on your subjective opinion about something because then it becomes just very subjective, obviously. So I teamed up with an international organization, World Economic Forum, that went out and did a huge survey. And unfortunately, they agreed with my stomach sensation that trust has actually dropped in the Western world. It has actually dropped with a number of up to 46% in the last 10 years. Now, that is really bad because if we compare trust and financial success, then we can absolutely prove that if we have a high level of trust, we will be way more successful financially. And if we do have a low level of trust, our financial success will be very low as well. And look at it this way, if we have a very high level of trust, our cost of transaction will be lower and our profit will then increase. And if we have a low level of trust, our transactional cost will be higher and our profit will be lower. In my new book, I have a very funny example about that, and that is a question, and you could all think about that. Would you like to have a free dinner at the best restaurant in the world? That was actually a real question that was asked 1.5 years ago. There was an American professor who decided that he wanted to invite a couple in Denmark to join him at Noma, that has been awarded 3 years in a row as the best restaurant in the world. Now, don't consider the distance wherever you might be on the face of the globe. Just remove that and just think, how would you react if somebody called you and said, could I invite you for dinner 3 weeks from now at Noma, the best restaurant in the world? How would you react, Jim, for instance? Well, what happened in this case is that the majority of everybody that he called just said, no, absolutely not. Because everybody was thinking, hey, there's a hidden agenda here. What is it he wanted? Does he want to abuse me somehow? And this poor professor from the US who basically just wanted to travel to Denmark and invite this couple, whoever they might be, to a dinner at Noma, he was so confused that he wasn't actually able to invite anybody to go out with him. And he was working on this for more than 5 or 6 weeks before he finally met a couple who said, okay, what the heck? Let's take the chance. What's the worst thing that could happen? So they joined him, and they had a great evening, 4 or 5 hours sitting there entertaining each other and enjoying the great food. They split their ways, and that was the end of the story. He basically just wanted to meet up with a nice couple in Denmark, invite them out, have a nice talk before he moved on his Scandinavian travel and went up to Norway and so on and so forth. This is a very interesting case for me in trust, because why is it that when somebody opens up and take charge and ask a question or offer us something, why is it that we automatically very often are thinking, this sounds wrong, there must be something behind this, what is it that he or she really wants? And I'm often asking negotiators throughout the world, how come that you don't have trust and you don't have faith in your counterpart? I'm pretty sure your parents didn't raise you this way. I'm sure most people's parents didn't raise us by saying, don't trust strangers, don't open up, don't talk to them, lie, bluff, hold back information. You know, most people's parents didn't raise us that way. They actually raised us to be nice, they raised us not to lie, they raised us to believe to a certain degree into other people without becoming naive. So when I'm asking business people and governmental officials, why is it we have that belief, it's very rare I get an answer, actually. So you could just think about if you get a phone call one of these days and somebody asks you to a very nice restaurant that you don't know, would you actually say yes and no? Another thing I just want to move on to and talk about trust is that, as I said, trust has been dropping a lot. And I have a lot of clients coming to me and say, so I get what you're saying. I agree with you. I think it's a problem that trust has been on a decrease as well. So how can I change everybody else? Now just think about that for a second. If you ask that question, how can I change my counterpart? How can I change everybody else? And the answer to that one is you can't. You know, we can't really change other people. We can't make other people change their view on trust. We can't tell other people just to start trusting the world and trust their counterparts and trust their colleagues. There's only one person on the face of the globe that you have a small chance of changing, and obviously that's yourself. So we have to start with ourselves, looking at ourselves, thinking, how's my trust? And do I actually trust other people? I'm not saying it's easy to trust ourselves. I could rephrase that and say, think about if you were changing the workplace and the office and your computer every day, you got a new manager and a new assigned working area, you would just love that, right? We all love changes as human beings. No, absolutely not, we don't. We prefer things to be the same way they were yesterday. I usually use the phrase that the only type of human being that really want to change is a baby with a wet diaper. From that point on, we basically like things as they always were. So that means it's not easy for us to change, but we need to focus on trust. And this is basically what I spend a lot of time on every year, just telling organizations and individuals that we have to learn to trust again. And I don't encourage people to be naive, because that's just as bad as not trusting, but we have to focus on trust. I recently got married to a wonderful American woman, and I don't know, all of you that are married, I don't know whether you've been going through the whole preparation thing of planning a wedding. We didn't have a huge wedding, but still we had to talk to a lot of vendors and partners and whatever. And I've been involved in a lot of business negotiation and mergers. And I have to say, arranging a wedding in the US competes with merging two companies in complexity and contracts negotiation and meetings and what you have. And what really hit me in the US, being a Dane, is that we had one vendor, for instance, that was doing a service for this wedding at the incredible high amount of money of $450. And I was talking to this vendor, and everything was fine, and she sent me a contract. And being a Dane, I was immediately completely surprised, thinking, a contract? Are we doing a contract on 8 pages for $450? And she said, yes, we have to do that. We have to do a contract. So I read through that whole contract, which if I converted that time reading the contract into what I would usually charge a client, it already costed me more reading the contract that has a total value for our vendor of $450 than actually paying the $450 to her. But sorry, one of the clauses in the contract was actually prepayment of the whole amount. So she asked for full prepayment 6 months prior to the wedding of $450. So I sent an email saying, I do understand that you want some kind of deposit, but if you're getting everything paid up front, why is that you want to do that? And then she came back to me and said, well, then I'm sure that my client is paying their bill, because otherwise I would lose out some potential gains, and I would have wasted my time. And I said, I fully understand that. But my next question to you would be then, how's the balance in this case? Because if your clients are paying up front completely, what happens if you don't show up? I mean, then you are carrying all the gains, they're carrying all the risk, and there's not an equal balance here. And then she was quiet for a couple of days and came back to me and said, no, but we can't actually change those terms. I need to have a full payment up front. And I've actually had a talk with my attorney 2 hours the other day discussing this topic in the contract. And I was actually sitting there thinking, we are talking $450. We are 6 months ahead of the wedding. And now she spent a couple of hours even discussing the topic and content of the contract with the attorney. She has been wasting so much time and effort on creating a contract that has a total value of $450 that it didn't make any sense in my world. Now, if I could just compare that to doing a wedding in Denmark or Scandinavia or wherever we might be where trust is higher, nobody would be asking for a contract. They would probably not even ask for an upfront payment. In worst case scenario, they might ask for 25 or 30% upfront payment, and the remaining fee would be payable after the event actually took place. Now, I'm just using this example to describe the huge difference in trust that we see in different countries around the world. I know a lot of Americans and people internationally who look at Scandinavia and don't really understand how that bumblebee can fly, because taxes are incredibly high, the cost of living is very high, the social system is very complex. But one of the key things that makes Scandinavia work is simply the level of trust. One company has a very easy access going to another company and says, I love your product, Jim. I would like to buy for $100,000 from you. And the seller would say, that sounds great. I will issue an invoice. You can pay net 30 days after receival of the goods. That's the way it works. Because in general, hopefully not becoming naive, but in general, two organizations or two individuals will believe in each other and have trust that, yes, you will do what is actually promised to each other. So there's not the need to huge complex contracts, and there's not a need to have prepayment or settlement or warranties or guarantees or attorneys or whatever. I have to say, those we got any Scandinavian listeners, that don't just lean back and feel good, because trust is actually dropping in the Scandinavian countries as well. But it's just, to me, a funny example on how trust is actually a key issue in today's world. I had the pleasure of lecturing at an executive MBA program recently, where we had some ministers from a government participating. And I'm not going to mention the country or whatever, it's not important, but I had the opportunity of talking to one of those ministers during lunch one of the days I was lecturing. And I was asking that person what they were doing in that local parliament in that country in order to secure that trust was increased in the country. And the woman, it was a woman, looked at me and said, what is you talking about? Why is trust an issue? Why should we at governmental level talk about trust? And I just briefly mentioned to her that trust has actually been dropping in her country as well, with about 46% in the last 10 years. And I could clearly see that that person, obviously involved in politics, didn't understand the concept, or didn't understand the political importance and the trouble we are in when trust is actually dropping. So if the only thing that you in this 1 hour webinar is getting out of that is trying to have a little bit of focus on trust, I would actually just be extremely happy. Moving on very quickly. The third items where we see
Keld,
sure.
before you move on, quick question, two questions around trust. One is, do you see trust as being somewhat of an input, more of an input into a successful negotiation, or has it become somewhat of a byproduct of a successful negotiation? Obviously, the answer is, well, could be both, but which do you think is the more primary of the two assets?
It's a great question, Jim. What I would like to say is, actually, you have to verbalize trust. You have to talk about trust. Trust is not just something that happens. I mean, you and I, Jim, if we didn't know each other and we had to do business with each other, I mean, we couldn't walk up to each other, shake hands, and say, Jim, I want trust openness in this negotiation. And you would say, that's great, let's do that, and then we go ahead. I mean, that's not the way it works, is it? So it's chicken and the egg, really. Is trust coming from a good relationship, or a good relationship coming from trust? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
And I suppose you can't really contractually mandate trust. Can you? I hereby warrant and represent that I will trust you, or you warrant and represent you'll trust me. But Keld, before we move on, one other thing. There was a question that came in back on the negotiation strategy, and it centers around how can an organization have a overarching negotiation strategy when in that organization there's different business units or different projects, each with their own different circumstances or objectives. Could you address that as well, either now or somewhere in your upcoming comments?
It's a great question. I'm not saying that one organization should only have one negotiation strategy. There could be up to 3 different strategies in a company. Now, obviously, as most people know, we have what we call a zero-sum negotiation strategy. And that basically means that we win at the expense of the counterpart. That's a lose-win, or sometimes a lose-lose negotiation, and in some cases that's the right strategy. I could even in some cases recommend that. Then you have the partnership strategy, where we focus on creating and developing the variables that we negotiate on. We might still be missing the complete level of trust, and we may not have focused on the concept that I call necroeconomics, that I described in the book as well. And necroeconomics is basically how do we make 4 plus 4 equals more than 8? How do we make that 10 or 12 or even more? So how do you utilize the potential between two parties? And then the third item is what we call partnership. And partnership is the open relationship where trust has been established. We have agreed on rules of the game, how to negotiate with each other. I'm just going to talk about right now, as we can see on this slide. And last but not least, the party has very clearly talked about and set up the rules of the game and the trust level. So that means they actually have been pre-negotiating prior to the negotiation on how to negotiate. And we need to address that. We have to talk about rules of the game, how to negotiate. So it's a great question because, no, I wouldn't say that a company like Rolls-Royce, for instance, should have one negotiation strategy. They could have different negotiation strategies depending on the project, depending on the department, and depending on the aim and the market as well. But what I just encourage organizations to do is having a strategy and know where to pick that strategy. And in way too many cases, the strategy is accidentally happening, or there might not even be one. They're just doing whatever they feel like, and they're not focusing on any specific strategy. So it's a great question. Right. If we just talk about rules. Yeah. Sorry, Jim. Did you want to add something?
No, I was just saying thank you. I appreciate you addressing it. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Now, rules of the game is basically, as I just mentioned a minute ago, how are we going to negotiate? And what we very often see, if I could use that image, imagine you're coming to a negotiation and you think you're going to play chess. But on the other side of the table is your counterpart sitting, and your counterpart is sitting with the racket ready to play tennis. That's how differently our negotiation or relationship approach could actually be perceived. So one side thinks they're going to play tennis, and you might think you're going to play chess. Now, this is going to be a really hard negotiation, obviously, because you can't play with each other. So as I just mentioned, back to this question asked, is that even before we sit down and start negotiating, we have to address how we're going to conduct this meeting today. So we have to negotiate on how to negotiate before we start negotiation. If we don't do that, we just waste a lot of time even figuring out how we're going to meet each other in that negotiation. The last item I have just before we move on is the last of the 4-1 that I clearly have identified in more than 20 years, that is identifying corporations that are more successful than others. And those that are more successful have clearly addressed the concept of necroeconomics. Now, necroeconomics is very simple. It's not really rocket science. Necroeconomics is basically utilizing the differences between the interest, the values, and the cost between two parties. What we have identified is that if 2 or more companies, organizations are negotiating with each other, they may reach an agreement, but what we have learned is that in most cases, they leave up to 42% of the total value on the table. That means that neither of the parties involved are getting that value, neither of the parties capitalize that value, and neither of the parties actually understand that that potential is there. And a very simple example of this could basically be the cost of capital. Money costs money, obviously, and money costs money at a different level to different organizations. So it could have a cost of 3% for one company and a cost of 6% of the other company. Utilizing that difference and sharing that difference is actually as simple as it's just described, necroeconomics. And we clearly see that those companies who are more successful in their relationships are focusing on necroeconomics as well. Now, I'm very often opening up a lot of my speaking engagement by talking about money, sex, and power for 2 reasons. One of them, it's always funny, people start laughing. And secondly, because I honestly believe that money, sex, and power is the driver to a lot of human beings on the face of the globe. I don't think we're as advanced as we sometimes would like us to be, and I do think that sometimes we're just very simple creatures that are just motivated by what might be out there. And I'm very often asking people, what is it that motivates you the most? Is it money, or is it sex, or is it power? I have a Dutch colleague who came to me about how they're going. He said, you know, your 3 words, Keld, money, sex, and power. What you're claiming is that if you got those and you're good at those, you will be successful. And I say, yeah, I truly believe in that. I mean, if you do have a lot of money and you do get the appropriate amount of sex that you would like, and you have a sex appeal, and you do have influence and power, you are typically successful. And then he said, well, excuse me, but I disagree. I don't think you need all 3 of them, he said. I think you only need 1, but if you have sufficient amount of one of those, you're going to get the other 2 automatically. Now, I've been thinking about my Dutch colleague comment since then, and honestly, I think he's right. I honestly think that if you have plenty of money, you're going to get sex automatically, or it could happen. And I do believe that if you've got plenty of money, you're going to have influence and power as well. On the other hand, if you have plenty of power and influence, you're going to get money, and you can definitely utilize it to get money. You could get sex as well. And if you have a strong sex appeal and are very attractive, well, you could actually utilize that. We have seen that throughout history to get money as well, and definitely influence and power as well. So I am talking about these three items in my new book as well. How do you actually focus on that, both from a very humor-oriented approach, but also how is that actually making an impact in the way that we make final decisions. Richard Branson is, without any doubt, a very successful person if we look at it from a business point of view, and a lot of people are saying from a human point of view as well. And Richard Branson read early on one of my books and made comments on that, and I was appreciating that a lot. And one of the comments he made later on is that business doesn't have to be a zero-sum game where some win and others loses. Now, that is one of my angles in my new book as well, that way too many people today are thinking that it's about winning or losing, and it is not. If we look back into history, it has been like this for many, many hundreds of years, but what we know today and what we can see, especially with a lot of vendors supplying, is that a lot of them have no more margins to give away. They have lost their profit, and they're basically struggling not to lose anymore because they are really being put under so much pressure that they're struggling and fighting to win whatever they can. And one of the reasons for that is that a lot of purchasing organizations globally today has grown into be huge, enormous, gigantic corporations. I could just mention something like Walmart, for instance, and that means that the buying power is enormous. So their vendors are basically struggling just to make a small profit out of any kind of business deal. So we are absolutely seeing in a lot of businesses, both retail and other businesses, that the buyer is winning at the expense of the seller. Now, think about it this way. What kind of consequences is that going to give the world in order, both talking about trust, but also about new product development or new resources put into stuff? And if we think back some 100 years, we had the Scottish gentleman Adam Smith, who is basically the founder of the modern economical thinking in today's world. And he wrote the book, The Wealth of Nations, that is basically the Bible of the capitalistic system. What is very interesting about Adam Smith's philosophy is that he's saying that everybody should do what's best for himself. That's basically the basic thinking of a capitalistic society. Professor Nash in the 60s in the US, who actually won the Nobel Prize, came out as the first one and said Adam Smith was absolutely wrong. So what he's basically saying is the creator of the Bible of the capitalistic system was all wrong in his thinking. Because Professor Nash was saying that we should all of us do what's best for ourselves, but at the same time, what is best for the group. Could you imagine that you stepped into a meeting or a negotiation and you started off by opening up by telling your counterpart the following: I'm here today to help you improve your profit, reduce your risk, and reduce your challenges. Would you like me to help you improve your profit and reduce your challenges? How do you think your counterpart would react? I've done that in lots of cases. I've had hundreds of clients opening up negotiation that way. And what is really interesting is the majority of counterparts is looking a little bit nervous, and then they say, yes, I would love that. Then we move on to the next question, and the next question would be, great, if we can agree that I'm here to help you improve your profit and reduce your cost and liabilities, how can you help me improve my profit, reduce my liabilities, and reduce my risk? Because that's the reason we're here. We're basically here today to help each other maximize our profit, reduce our risk, and reduce our liabilities. Now, this is changing the game plan. This is basically now changing the way that we think. So what I'm very often opening up in the presentation saying to my clients is, this is not about winning or losing. This is basically about becoming financially more successful and way more successful in how we conduct business. But this actually requires a completely different method of thinking, just like Professor Nash are talking about, and just like Richard Branson are talking about in his quote here on this slide. Bertrand Russell is a very famous British economical professor who has been saying, it has been said that man is a rational animal. But all my life I've been searching for evidence which could support this. And he's actually known to be one of the creators of the mathematical system and the way that we do math today. So I would actually use the phrase that he's probably a very rational person, and still being a very rational person, he comes out with a comment like that. Back to intelligence is overrated, what you really need to succeed. What we conclude in this book is that all of us are really extremely irrational. We have a tendency to buy with emotions and then act the facts that actually make our emotional decision, the final decision, right. So that means regardless whether we are getting into a merger with a counterpart, we are buying or selling stuff, whether we are picking a new man or wife, or we are buying a house or a car, we basically make most of our decision on an emotional level, and then we act the fact to prove that our emotional decision was right. Now, this is provoking a lot of people I'm meeting globally. I meet a lot of people saying that can't be the case. I mean, I'm very rational, I make very rational choices. And the interesting thing is that, yes, we do believe that we do that, but research clearly shows us that we don't. Daniel Kahneman is a professor that has won the Nobel Prize in economics, which is interesting because he's actually coming from psychology. He's been writing enormous amount of great books that I would recommend. And he is one of the leading researchers in behavioral economics globally. And his conclusion is, without any doubt, that we are extremely irrational in our decision making as human beings. So that means that we are basically not as rational as we would like to be, since our emotions is based, since our decision is based on emotions. We have created what we call the 1585 rules, and that basically means that only 15% of the reason that we are successful is based on what we call technical skills. Our technical skills is our education, it is our knowledge, what we know about the thing, and it's the experience, how many years have we been working on something. Approximately 85% of the reason that we are successful in life is based on human engineering. And human engineering is basically how we work with other people. So that means, do other people like us? Do other people trust us? Do other people, would other people like to work with us? So that means that we claim in our book that 85% of the reason that those who are successful, that is based on their skills in human engineering, and only 15% of the reason they are successful is based on their formal education, their knowledge, their intelligence, and the experience on whatever they're doing. Now, just think for a second that we were living in a world where it was 100-0. That means it was 100% human engineering and 0 on technical skills. I never ever hope we end up in a world like that, because then all of us would be really great at talking about something we know absolutely nothing about. That is definitely not a world we would like. But the case in today's world is that most people are actually quite skilled in what they're doing. I have the pleasure of meeting hundreds and hundreds of people every year, and it's very rare that I meet somebody I would call stupid. They are very intelligent people, they're well educated, they know what they're doing. So all of them are home free on the 15%. But I mean a huge amount of people annually who are definitely not home free on the 85% of the human engineering, because they don't focus on that. They are so focused on the 15%, and the 15% in today's world is not necessarily the important thing. It's not the competitive edge. Because most people out there actually got a very good university degree today. They're educated, they have the experience, they know what they're doing. And so do the people at the competitive company. They have actually gone through a similar education, they have the same information, they might have the same experience. So what I'm just focusing on and generally talking a lot about today is the 85%, which is human engineering. And interestingly enough, part of human engineering is obviously your skills and talent in creating trust, your skills and talent in communicating, your skills and talent in negotiation, and your skills and talent within creating a good relationship and working well with your counterpart. This is a photo I took myself in Singapore on a recent trip, and what it says up here is nothing is quite as precious as trust. Now this is a jewelry store, so trust, obviously, if you're going in there to buy a diamond at a price of, let's say, $6,000, you want to trust that store that what they're selling you is absolutely a diamond, and it got the value that they claim it has. So in this case, I took this picture, this photo, because it actually reminded me that, hey, trust could be the foundation and the fundamental in actually being successful. So In the book, we talk about 7 negotiation tips for...
Say, Keld,
Yeah, yeah.
could I interrupt? Because I think this is a good point to interject a comment that I've been
Sure.
trying to put in that I've wanted to find the right spot for, and comes from one of our listeners in Doha, in Qatar. And he's saying that I would say trust is earned in the existing contract under implementation, and the benefits of trust are reaped while negotiating the new contract. Does not stop here. The trust grows exponentially in the new contract implementation and win-win situations. Both parties are ready to push the limits of efficiency on the scale of trust. I assume that you would agree with that. Do you have any further comment to Shaquille's point on that?
No, I would agree. Obviously, the longer we're in a relationship, the higher the chances are of improving trust. What I would still recommend is focus on trust at an early stage, because we can actually make a shortcut and reduce the time it requires to create trust if we verbalize it, talk about it, make some rules, and obviously ourselves are reasonable, honest, and transparent. Again, as I said earlier, Jim, I'm not promoting to become naive, because naive is just as bad as having no trust. So it's not about having too much trust or just believing everything that the counterpart is saying. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm just saying focusing on trust as one of the three-legged stools parameters. So trust, behavioral economics, and negotiation in any kind of relationship is truly important. But I absolutely agree with the comment. Trust is obviously growing throughout time. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and you know, I got to throw in, this was probably 10 years ago or so, a study out of the Harvard Business Review where there was a study done. They created somewhat of a 2x2 matrix with an X and Y axis to it. And they asked, you know, who would you want to be on your corporate team? And this was to internal project type professionals inside of companies, and how do you decide who do you pick on your team? And one of the axes was expertise. The other axis was something like personal affinity, which would include likability, trust, and various things of that nature. And you know, in one quadrant it was the likable expert. And the, you know, another quadrant, it was the evil expert, and then in another quadrant it was like the likable idiot, for lack of better. Well, and then there was, of course, in the other quadrant, the evil idiot, and no one wanted the evil idiot to participate, and everyone always wanted the likable expert to participate in their projects. But the question really focused on, okay, now you've got down to the evil expert and the likable idiot. Which of these two types of individuals would you want to then engage? And surprisingly, much to the dismay of people at Harvard, I guess, about 2/3, as I recall the number, 2/3 would prefer the likable idiot over the evil expert. And when asked it, why would that be, the answer somewhat said, well, you can always improve their expertise. You can give them training, you can give them experience and all, and you can always improve that expertise, but you can't improve, you know, the things such as the trust and the likability.
Yeah.
So I sense that very much plays into what your research is showing as well.
Yeah, that's a very funny study as well. No,
well, I don't think Harvard would call their study funny, but I agree with you.
Yeah. Okay, great. Just moving on a bit. I found this statue here recently. I'm living in Arizona in the U.S. Obviously, that's an old Western state, and there was this great statue here that said "binding contract." And you see two cowboys and a horse shaking hands. Isn't that interesting? In the 1800s, that was a binding contract we got right there. There was no attorneys involved, there was no contract, there was no papers, there was no signature. They did a binding contract, and I can promise you, if one of them violated the contract, he'd probably get shot. Now, I'm not saying that in 2015 that's the outcome, that we should eliminate the lawyers and we just take things in our own hands and shoot the counterpart that is violating the contract. But it's just funny thinking about that. 200 years ago, we were actually able to make contracts that in some cases probably turned out to be better and more simple. In my own world, I started my career back in rank Xerox. That was the name of the company in Europe, Xerox in the US, and I started in sales and marketing, and I was selling huge production printers that had a cost of typically $200,000 then. In those days, I'm not exaggerating, a contract selling a huge production printer that has a value of $200,000 could be done on 4 pages. That was it. We did a contract, everybody was happy, and both parties went each their ways and fulfilled whatever they were expected to do. Now, I don't think I'm that old, but it still feels like this was a long time ago. It's not that long time ago, actually. It's about, 25, 30 years ago. Anyway, I was just revisiting in connection with the book Xerox about 2 years ago, and then funny enough, Xerox are still selling these huge production printers. Obviously, they're more technology advanced today, but the price is still about the same. And then I was just asking some of the people I talked to, could you show me a contract selling a printer that has a total cost of $200,000? Now, just remember what I said earlier. When I was at Xerox in those days, signing a contract with a client, buying a printer that has a cost of $200,000 was about 4 pages. How big do you think the contract were today in 2013 when I was there? The contract today selling the exact same equipment was now 7 binders full of papers, just basically covering the same items we did then in 4 pieces of papers. Now, I actually met a few people who had been with Xerox throughout this period, so they were there then when I was part of it, and they were there today. And so I asked all of them, where do you see that you got the best business deal? Was it then when the contract was 4 pages, or is it today when the contract is 7 binders? And all of them agreed the contract, the outcome, the profit, and the happiness of the deal was so much higher back then when it was so simple. Today they're saying we can't even figure out ourselves what the contract is all about, or what clauses is where and how, and so on and so forth. So that just reminds me again how come it is that we complicate the world. I'm not saying necessarily that we should go back to a binding contract just being a handshake. I do believe in a written contract, but why not simplify things? Why does it have to be complicated? And when I ask my audiences around the world, how many of them that believe the world is so much simpler today than it was 20 years ago or 10 years ago, nobody reacts. Most people in today's world actually believe that the world is way more complicated today than it was 10 or 20 years ago. And that frustrates me a bit because honestly, I can't see that the point of waking up every morning, the point can't be that we're thinking, how can I complicate the world the most for my counterpart? It must really be, how can I simplify the world both for my counterpart and myself? Now, just talking about that, there's an American professor called Daniel Yankelovich who wrote a book called Profit with Honor. And if some of you have an interest in trust and profit, I would definitely recommend this book. He did this study that I was been allowed to quote in my book as well. And what he's basically saying is, as you can read the headline up here, this is about confidence and trust level. And what he's basically saying, in the 50s, the trust in the Western world was pretty high. Then it dropped in the 70s, increased a little bit again in the 80s and 90s, dropped in the early 90s, raised to a very high level in the late 90s. And today, in 2015, we are at the lowest level ever recorded in the more than 70 years we have been putting down data on trust. And this is actually very interesting when we look at the whole picture, because this graph is very similar to another graph that we're doing in the financial world. I don't know if any of the listeners out there right now can identify what graph that might be. But the other graph that this one is very similar to is actually the financial development in the world. Isn't that funny? So when we're talking about financial development or financial success or growth, financial growth, what we see is the 50 was pretty high, late 80s, early 90s was high, late 90s was very high, and then the crisis came 2007, 2008, and hopefully we're getting out of it, or we are out of it already, but we definitely see that the financial situation has been very similar to the development in trust. Back to the chicken and egg question. Do we have a low level of trust today because we had a crisis, or do we have a crisis because we have a low level of trust? Now, I can't answer that question. It's just very interesting just to compare those two models right here. Another model I just want to share with you from Yankelovich as well is actually motivation versus complexity. Just getting back to what I said earlier about the contract and the contract growing from 4 pages to 7 binders. What Yankelovich is saying is complexity in a job in the last 20 years has increased from 43 to 62%. So that is regardless whether you might be an engineer, an attorney, a person working in finance, or whatever you might be doing. What he's basically saying, and I agree, is that the complexity in a job has been growing with about 50% in the last 20 years. So that means that your job is 50% more complicated and difficult today than it was 20 years ago. At the same time, he's also saying that the motivation in the job has been decreased by about 10%. Now, when I show this graph or this slide here in presentation, I often meet people saying, well, that's not a lot. I mean, losing motivation by about 10%, that's not that bad. Yes, it is actually, because if we see that complexity has increased with about 50% and motivation has dropped by about 10, we have a huge gap between those two lines. And that huge gap up here is one of the many, many reasons that we actually see that trust is dropping as well, because it's so much more complex working in today's world, and the motivation in actually solving that complexity has been dropping as well. Could you imagine, all of you, that if motivation was increasing at the same level as complexity? That would mean that we'll be able to have a city on Mars right now, because, you know, if we are motivated as human beings, we are basically able to do a lot. Now, I know we are getting close to the time where we have to wrap up, but I just want to show Mr. Einstein again. And he actually saying, more the knowledge, less of the ego, less of the knowledge, more of the ego. And again, knowledge is it's a very good thing. We should all have knowledge, but sometimes knowledge is actually in the way of creating the best outcome. And what I see is that when people talk about cross-cultural issues today, I have a German client that came to me recently and said, I'm going to negotiate with a partner in Korea 2 weeks from now. How should I deal with that? How can I be aware of the cultural differences from Germany to Korea? I said, well, you know what, there's not really any. And he looked very suspicious at me and said, you've got to be joking. I mean, there must be a huge difference between Germany and Korea. And I said, no, not really. And he said, come on, there must be something. And I said, well, sure. I mean, in Korea, they eat slightly differently. The nature is slightly different, but that's about it. The way that they conduct business in Korea and Germany are most likely the same. What is it I mean by that? Because obviously we have different cultures around the world. But what I just find very often when I'm lecturing at an executive MBA class somewhere in the world is that I have people from Japan, China, Singapore, Australia, the US, England, Germany, Italy, whatever, sitting in the same room. They are all receiving the same materials, they're all receiving the same books, the same content, the same professors. So they're basically today schooled in the same thing. So that means that the business approach around the world today is way more similar than ever before. So when this German gentleman travels to Korea, the Korean counterpart might as well study the exact same materials as the German guy. Just back to Mr. Einstein's problem here is that this actually generates another problem. It helps us in certain areas because it's easier to understand each other. But one of the other problems is that less of the knowledge, more the ego. So that means that sometimes as well, knowledge might stand in the way of being creative or thinking in a slightly different way. Now, just to wrap up very quickly, Jim, one of the chapters in the book is 100 excuses that will block your success. And that sounds like a very ambitious plan. But what I've really tried to do is listing the 100 excuses that actually stop ourselves from creating the most success in our own life. And if I just ask all the listeners right now, and please don't lie to yourself, how often do you actually mess up your own success? I mean, that happens a lot. I actually, very often, I think back to my life, I think I've messed up my own success more than other people have messed up my success. And just looking at the slide for a second, if you really want to do something, you'll find a way. And if you don't want to do something, you'll definitely find an excuse. And that happens a lot. And just to very, very quickly go through some of them, some of the excuses I have found throughout a lot of years is that people come to me and say, I don't have the right network. People say, I don't have enough money to do whatever. So you might say, someone else is already doing that, or I can't take a risk right now. I'm afraid of what my customers will think, or people aren't ready to hear this. Or I could continue like this. And I just, in the book, been trying to limit all of these or reduce all those excuses down to 100 major ones and just actually put up an answer to that. So it's kind of a checklist just going through what is limiting our potential success. And remember what I said when we started this presentation, that success is really getting what you want and being happy about what you get. So so that's basically the key point here. We have about 4 or 5 minutes left according to my watch. I was just thinking, Jim, have you got any listeners, any questions right now?
Yeah, there's a couple here, but I do want to encourage those listening. If you do have questions, please do put those into the questions box on the GoToWebinar software panel off on the right-hand side of your screen. Couple comments, Keld, come in. One is the trust life cycle shown by me, the person who wrote this, spans 7 to 10 years of hard work and the relationship It goes on, we were successful in implementing a number of mega projects, including world's largest LNG trains, basically through, investing in a 7-year period of time. What is your thought on, does it really take 7 to 10 years? Obviously, I mean, it varies, but what do you see as being a normal implementation?
Well, first of all, I would say 7 to 10 years. Obviously, I don't know the project or anything involved in it, but that sounds like a very, very, very long time. Now, trust obviously is something that takes time to create, and you can lose it very quickly. It takes really perhaps even down to minutes or seconds to lose trust, and it could take you a lot longer to create that trust. But end of the day, just getting back to what I said earlier, to me really creating trust is obviously doing what you're saying you want to do. It's the action that creates trust, is not the talk. But again, verbalizing it, talking about it, and even agreeing on rules of the game. What we very often do with our clients, just to add that, is that we work with them to create rules of the game. So they actually have a kind of agreement, just one paper, where it's basically listed how they want to conduct this relationship. And there's not legal terms, there's not financial terms. This is basically just how do we want to interact with each other.
And Keld, on the comment, it's coming off of a campaign of 5 different drilling projects in the oil and gas sector from 2002 onward.
Yeah. Okay. I would say it's really a question about focusing on creating trust, and then back to what I said earlier, we can't create other people, change other people. We have to change ourselves. So it's basically an approach into how do we believe that we want to work. Do we believe in trust? And sometimes, Jim, I meet people who come up to me and say, I get what you're saying about combative people that lies and bluff and don't have any trust. But you know what? It's all great what you're saying, but that doesn't work in my industry. It doesn't work in my business. Because everybody I'm working with is bluffing, they're lying, they're not opening up. And you know what, Jim, if I meet people like that, I typically look around and see if I can find a mirror. And then I hold up that mirror in front of the person who just said what I just quoted. And then I say, here you go, here's the bluffing, lying person who don't have any trust in any other people. And I'm just saying that not to offend anyone, but very often if you have the belief that everybody else is cheating and you can't trust anyone, then you simply have to look at yourself. Again, I don't recommend becoming naive, but if you start becoming more trustworthy, if you start to trust other people, very often that trust is actually responded from other people as well.
Yeah, and in that same conversation, the one last point he raised is that there were no disputes, no litigation, no arbitration during that period of time. But I do need to get on to one last question before the time lapses. I think it's a great question, and that is, how can you measure your own level of human engineering?
That is a great question.
It sure is.
Well, we do actually have a checklist in the book that you could ask other people. Now, you can't measure your own. You have to have other people measure yours because obviously you are very subjective to your own behavioral approach and how you deal with other people. But there are some simple questions that you can ask other people, and there are some simple questions that you could actually ask yourself. And in that aspect, identify how high you might be on human engineering. I do unfortunately find people, especially people who are very strong on the 15% who believe they're very strong on human engineering. And they need some kind of realization that obviously come throughout life, but it helps them sometimes if they have a kind of objective survey or checklist of questions that actually make them realize that, hey, I may not be as high on human engineering that I originally thought I would be.
Okay, and I assume if you're asking somebody else to help you with that, it's somebody you should trust. Okay, well, we are basically out of time, so I do need to wrap things up. Keld, as usual, great insights and very interesting content. So thank you very much for that. Thank you to the listeners who joined us today for your great questions and your participation as well. We will wrap up, and as mentioned earlier, we will get the slides and a link to the recording off to people who've participated in this. So again, Keld, thank you very much, and again, thank you everyone else. Have a great rest of your day.